What's up guys, this is Gary and I'm here today to bring you Hot Boys Garage episode 12, where I'm going to show you how to split the cases on a 2004-2005 Honda TRX450R engine, replace the crank bearings and seals, fully disassemble and inspect the transmission, and then put everything back together again. This is going to be a pretty long video, so to kind of help with that, I've got an outline in the video description that shows you at which time marks in the video each step takes place. That way, hopefully, if nothing else, you can use the video as a reference to skip to the process of the step that you might need a refresher on. So this video is specific to the 2004-2005, that is the first generation Honda TRX450R quad engine. But a lot of the same concepts are going to apply to most 450cc based Honda Power Sports engine. Some specific steps will differ based on your model and year, so I do recommend going ahead and picking up an OEM service manual specific to your model and year. Also, this video outlines how I specifically do this job. Obviously, there's more than one way to do it and more than one way to do each step, so keep that in mind as you're going through the video, and feel free to find alternative methods if needed. And a quick disclaimer, please only attempt to do this if you're fully capable of doing it. Otherwise, it's recommended to use a professional. That said, I assume no responsibility for any damages to your engine or yourself. Also, for this video, I don't go into any great detail about piston to valve clearance, deck height, degree in a camshaft, or any other details like that. If you're interested in those specific things, check out the previous Hot Boys Garage episodes. I'll stick links to those in the video description. Okay, before we begin, make sure you got a clean workspace with plenty of room to lay things out in order and in the grouping on how they go back together. All right, now let's get started. I'm going to quickly go over the tools that you're going to need to complete the job. We'll need some common garage tools, a few specialty tools, and then I'll also put up a list of OEM parts and part numbers that you may need as well. First up, you'll need an assortment of ratchets, large and small, extensions, decent set of metric sockets and metric wrenches. You'll also need a large set of metric sockets as well. I think the main ones out of this set will be the 17, 22, and 27 that we'll need. You'll also need some Allen wrenches, medium and small snap ring pliers, scissors, razor blade, and a scraper razor blade, an assortment of large and small flat and Phillips screwdrivers, a small magnet like this, assortment of pliers, red and blue Loctite, and you may need green Loctite as well. You also need some small picks like this, a seal puller, hammer and rubber mallet, a good battery powered or air powered impact with really good loosening torque, makes the job a whole lot easier. Flashlight will come in handy, some acetone or gasoline and a rag for cleaning gasket surfaces. Moving on to the more specialized tools, you'll need a flywheel puller. Both Motion Pro and Tusk, Rocky Mountain ATV's brand, make one of these. Make sure you get one with the protective end cap for the crank. You'll need a special socket like this for the counterbalancer nut, and you'll either need a Motion Pro gear jammer like this or a couple of pennies to jam the gears. Just know that they're probably going to end up looking like this when we're done. You'll also need a clutch hub holding tool, either a homemade one like this or this one from Tusk, Rocky Mountain ATV. You need a crank bearing puller like this one from Rocky Mountain ATV, Tusk brand. You'll need a good bearing driver set like this. It's got an assortment of sizes. If you elect to heat up your cases to get them to accept bearings, you'll need a propane torch like this and some heavy leather welding gloves. Also, don't forget to pick up an OEM service manual that is specific to your model and year. For lubricants and cleaners, I'd recommend picking up some Yamalube. Comes in handy for head stud nuts, torquing them down. Some assembly lube, brake clean, contact cleaner, some press fit lubricant, and some engine oil as well for lubing up parts as they go in. You'll also need some blocks, wood or some sort of material that'll allow you to block up the crankcase or the crank whenever we've got it on its side on the bench. For pressing bearings in and out, it's highly recommended to at least get a small 12-ton shop press like this. You can pick them up pretty cheap at Harbor Freight, or maybe see if you've got a buddy that's got one that you can use. If you're going to go ahead and adjust your valves while you're at it, I'd go ahead and pick up a Hott Cams shim kit. You'll also need a good digital caliper or a micrometer, some feeler gauges, and pen and paper so you can write everything down. Lastly, you'll need a bunch of parts. I recommend using mostly OEM parts. You need gaskets, bearings, and seals. Now, these are going to vary on your engine build and what year your engine is. For the 0405 Honda TRX450R engine, I'll put a list of OEM parts and their part numbers in the video now. Before we get started, I'm going to go ahead and assume that you know how to get your engine out of the frame and onto the bench and ready for disassembly. But here's a quick overview on what you need to do in order to get your engine out of the frame. First, you'll need to remove your seat, your gas tank, and your rear plastics. Then you'll need to remove your intake and air box, drain the gasoline out of your carburetor and remove it and the intake to carb boot. Then you'll need to remove your exhaust, including your header pipe, as well as the crankcase, valve cover, and transmission breathers. You should go ahead and drain both the transmission oil and engine oil, as well as drain the coolant from the bottom water pump bolt here. Over here on the left side, you'll need to remove your chain, sprocket, case saver, shifter, the clutch mount here, as well as all of the electrical connections to the stator. And you'll also need to remove the oil cooler bolts here and here too. Also, don't forget to remove the spark plug cap on top of the engine. If you've got a kicker bike, go ahead and remove the kicker. If you've got an electric start bike, make sure you disconnect your battery. You also need to remove the coolant hoses here, over here on the other side, and the thermostat electrical connection here to get the engine out of the frame. It is usually easier if you go ahead and remove the rear brake lever as well as the right peg. And then the last step will be to remove all of the motor mounts. The top motor mounts will be up here, front lower motor mounts here, the bottom middle motor mount here, and then the rear swing arm pivot bolt also runs through the motor and it'll need to be removed as well. And then with everything removed, you should be able to lift your motor up between the top of the frame rails, tilt it to the right, and gently slide it out the right side of the frame. Once you get it on the bench, we'll be ready to go. A quick note before we get started, the engine that I'm going to use for this how-to video is my dedicated 649cc TRX450R drag engine. It's going to be probably a little bit different than yours. This engine has a custom billet head, a billet cylinder with no water jackets, so that means no coolant runs through this engine. And then another big difference is over here on the right hand side of the engine, there is no kicker or gears, there is no electric starter gears. This engine starts off of a remote start bolt that's connected directly to the crankshaft, and we use an external starter to start it. It's got a lockout clutch and clutch cover, and again, since it has no water running through it, it has coolant block-offs here and down here inside of the right side cover, as well as no water pump or mechanical seal here. So I just wanted to make that known before we start so that whenever I start cracking into this engine, if it looks different from your engine, you'll know why, but a lot of the same concepts apply. So now we'll go ahead and get started with this engine on the bench and on the engine stand. First, we'll come over to the left side of the engine and remove the stator bolts. There are 9 of them, and usually the bolts take an 8mm socket. Once you've got all 9 of the bolts removed, pull your stator cover straight off. If you don't have an engine stand or somebody to help you, just be aware that the stator is a big magnet and it sits inside the flywheel, which is a big steel object, so they're going to want to stay stuck to each other. It can be a little hard to get off sometimes. Now with the stator cover removed, we're going to take a 19mm socket on our Milwaukee 1/2-inch impact, loosen and remove the flywheel nut and washer behind it. And then to get our flywheel off of the crank, we use a flywheel puller with the protective end cap that goes over the crank. We'll take this, it threads right onto the crank snout, and then we'll take our flywheel puller. There's threads on the flywheel. This slips right over top of the crank snout protector and threads all the way onto the flywheel. Then we'll take the puller bolt, run it in to where it's finger tight up against that protective cap inside there. And then this particular puller takes a 24mm. We're going to set our impact to tighten or clockwise, because what we're going to want to do is tighten this up against that crank snout protector in there, which will pull the flywheel off of the crank. And so you don't have to go to town on this thing. One quick little zip and it should pull the flywheel loose. Then we'll loosen this guy up. We'll take our puller off, take our crank protector cap off, and the flywheel will come right off. Don't forget to go in here and take out this little dowel. Put it aside and make sure you don't forget to reinstall it whenever you're reassembling. Over on the right hand or clutch side, we're going to remove the 18 bolts that are holding this right outer clutch cover on. And in the video, I'll circle which ones you got to remove. And since a lot of these bolts in the right side outer cover tend to vary in length, I just try to loosen them all up, leave them in the spot where they go, pull this whole thing off as one piece, and then set it down like this so I can keep the bolts in the place where they go. Up here at the front right, on an engine where you run water, there's a coolant passage to the water pump. This will have a little aluminum sleeve in it with an O-ring. Go ahead and pull that out of there and set it aside. Now with the side cover off, we're going to remove the 6 bolts holding the clutch springs in. This engine here has a lockout clutch system on it. If you've got a stock bike, it's going to look a little bit different here. There'll still be 6 bolts with a 10mm head holding the 6 clutch springs in. So we'll take those out and then pull the clutch springs out and set them aside too. Now with the clutch springs out, we can go ahead and pull the pressure plate directly off. A lot of times the clutch pack, that is the fibers and steels, are going to want to come with it. You can go ahead and pull them all out as one unit. One thing to note on the inside of the pressure plate, there's a little washer down in there. And it rides on this arm right here on top of these needle bearings. Make sure you don't lose that. Make sure it goes back on there whenever you're reassembling. Next, you can go ahead and pull the clutch actuator rod directly out. Next step is there's a lock washer underneath of this clutch hub nut here, and it should be folded up onto the nut like this on 2 sides. See, mine's a little bit mangled. We need to get in there with a small and or large screwdriver and hammer and gently fold those down so that they're flat, so that we can spin this nut off. You need to make sure that you're gentle whenever you're prying on these things. This clutch inner hub and the clutch spring towers are all cast aluminum, so they're pretty fragile. So be patient and go slow at folding this lock washer down flat. With the lock washer folded down flat, we're going to use a clutch hub holding tool, either a homemade one like this, or something from Motion Pro or Tusk like this. And we're going to use that to hold the basket while we take our impact and 27mm socket and spin this nut off of here. With the nut off, we can pull the lock washer off. There's another washer underneath. Then the inner hub can come out, and there's a big washer in behind it. Sometimes it sticks to the hub, sometimes it sticks to the basket. Then you can pull the whole clutch basket up and out. And there's some needle bearings and a collar that ride between the transmission main shaft and the clutch basket you can pull off. Next, we'll remove the right side crank bolt. Can't remember what size socket this normally is. This engine here has a remote starter bolt in its place. Regardless, you should be able to spin that right off in the impact. Now this might be a good time to mention, if your engine has a kickstart, there'll be a big spring and some kicker gears up in here that you'll need to remove. Or if it's electric start, there'll be some starter gears up in here. Since this is a dedicated drag engine, it doesn't have an electric start or a kicker. It just has a remote start bolt coming out here, and we just use an external starter. Refer to your service manual on how to get those in and out. Next, we can go ahead and pull this gear off. After that, we're going to come over here to the counterbalancer assembly. This counterbalancer has a lock nut on it, and this lock nut should be staked up here, meaning it's been punched in to keep it from backing out. Hopefully that's going to show up on camera. We're going to take a small screwdriver, get in there and push this out without damaging the counterbalancer shaft, and that'll allow us to put our special socket on this guy and spin it off. Okay, now with this nut unstaked, you're going to take and use a Motion Pro gear jammer, or you can use a penny. Since a penny is made out of copper and it's softer than these steel gears, you can jam those up in here and that penny will bend and break before the gears will. And we'll use this special socket for the counterbalancer nuts on our impact, and we'll zip it off. Now with it loose, you can pull the nut off. Then underneath that, there's a small washer and the weight. Move your gear jammer. Then you can go ahead and pull this gear off the crank, and then you can go ahead and pull this gear off of the counterbalancer shaft. Then there's a long key that you'll need to pull out before you can push this counterbalancer shaft back in there, and it'll pull out the other side. So we come over here on the other side of the engine, work it a little bit, it'll come right out. Next, we'll work on removing the shifter and ratchet assembly here. So we can go over to the left side and just tap the shift shaft a little bit, and as long as your shift shaft isn't too bent, you should be able to kind of work it back and forth, pull it right out. And don't forget that there's a little washer down in here. You need to stay with it. Next, we'll take 10mm socket, loosen up both of these bolts. And what I usually do is I pull this whole assembly out of here as one piece. And I'll show you what I mean here in just a second. There's a whole plate assembly removed and kept it all together here. These little guys, there's little springs down in there. I usually try to keep those all together so that I don't have to try and remember how it goes back together. And you should be left with something like this. And there's more than one way to do this. What I normally do in order to get this guy and this arm out, use your 8mm and zip this guy out. And then I'll take a 12mm deep well socket, and I'll zip this bolt out, and I can pull this straight out. Just do whatever works for you. Now with those two pieces out, you should be left with something that looks like this. And so we're pretty much done with the right side for now. Over here on the left side, you can go ahead and pull your clutch arm up and out. Now I usually come up here to the top at the valve cover and remove the 3 valve cover bolts. Usually on a stock engine, those are 10mm bolts. And then pull the valve cover and its gasket off. With the valve cover off, you can come over here to the left side and remove the 2 cam sprocket bolts. And then after you've removed both cam sprocket bolts, you come down here to where your cam chain tensioner is. And this one has a custom manual cam chain tensioner. I'll stick a picture of a stock one in the video now. I'd recommend just going ahead and removing the two, I think it's 8mm bolts here, and pulling the cam chain tensioner off completely. After you've removed the cam chain tensioner, you should be able to now easily slip the cam gear off of the cam flange, then slip the cam gear down and out of the inside of the cam chain and remove it. Then you can just let your cam chain fall down and leave it there for now. Next, we're going to remove the cam and cam carrier assembly by removing these 4 bolts here. Before you do that, it might be a good idea to go ahead and check your valve clearances to find out what your clearance specs are. See your cam card or consult your engine builder. And then once you've got your clearances checked, I'd recommend going ahead and writing it down. When you're pulling your cam carrier up and off, keep an eye on the intake lobe buckets here. They ride inside of the cam carrier. A lot of times they'll stay inside there. And once you pick it up and off, sometimes they'll slip right out of there and fall down, hit the floor. Really don't want that to happen. And a lot of times the intake valve shims will stick to the buckets as well. Keep an eye on those. Sometimes the intake valve shims will stay up here on top of the valve stem, and then almost always the exhaust valve shims will stay here. And you'll need to use like a little magnet to get those out of there. I'd recommend pulling those out, measuring each one with a set of calipers, and then writing down those measurements with which valve they go to. That way you can put it back together and be in spec, or at least know what size shims are in there, what your valve clearances are, and then what size shim needs to go back in order to get your valve clearance back in spec. Next, we'll remove the cylinder head. First, remove the 2 bolts here on the left hand side of the head. Then you'll remove the 4 nuts on the head stud bolts here and here. After that, you should be able to just lift your head up and off of the cylinder. You might have to wiggle a little bit back and forth to get it to come up over the head studs. Under normal circumstances, you would pull the head off and then pull the gasket, the cylinder head gasket off. And then there's a little seat down in the cylinder here where the timing chain guide sits. You would pull that up and out. But since this engine uses a special kind of gasket, a copper gasket, and this 3-bond glue stuff, it's really hard to get the cylinder and the head separated. And right now I don't have a second set of hands to kind of hold the engine while I try and pull the cylinder up and off to get that glue unstuck. So I'm going to be pulling the head and cylinder off as one unit to make it easier. But I'll stick a couple of pictures in the video now of what the engine's going to look like once you pull your head off and the cylinder's still on there. After that, you'll remove this bolt down here that holds the cylinder onto the cases, and then gently lift the cylinder up and off of the piston, and make sure you support the piston whenever you pull the jug off. That way it doesn't flop around and get nicked up. Now with the cylinder off, you can go ahead and remove this cam chain bracket right here, held on by the 8mm bolt, and you can remove the cam chain tensioner piece here, held on by this 8mm bolt. Then you can just go ahead and pull the cam chain off of the bottom of the crank sprocket and out. Next, you'll need to take a small pair of snap ring pliers like this, come down here, spread and remove this snap ring on the oil pump gear. Then after that is removed, you can pull the oil pump gear straight off. Next, we'll remove this 8mm bolt here and its keeper so we can pull this little valve out of here. After that, we'll remove this bolt down here and the keeper that keeps the oil strainer in here. With this bolt removed, you can pull the oil strainer straight out. It's got a little rubber piece here that holds it in place, and it's got kind of a rubber O-ring down in there as well. And then one last thing we need to do is remove the counter shaft spacer here before we split the cases. Okay, now I've pulled the engine off the stand and laid it down on its side, and you're going to loosen and remove these 11 bolts. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. And then most engines will have like a little breather tube here as well. Then with those 11 bolts out, flip the engine around to where the right side is facing up and the left side is facing down. You'll have to block it up so that the crank snout isn't resting on your workbench. And then all we'll need to do is gently lift the right case up and off of the right case. They should separate fairly easily. You might have to push down on the transmission main shaft, on the transmission counter shaft, and the crank over here to make sure that they stay in place. All that stuff should stay in the left case, and the right case should separate pretty easily. Once you've got the inner cases separated, you should be left with your left case half that looks like this. The crank rod and piston should remain in it. This little collar here may or may not stay on the crankshaft, and the transmission stays in as well. Then over here is our right case. As you can see, the gasket stayed with it. Sometimes it will stay with this case or the other case, or it might rip. Regardless, you should probably use a new OEM gasket whenever you put this back together. Next, we'll pull the transmission out. And what I normally do is I'll take the spring off first. This is for an override transmission. You probably won't have this in yours. Then I'll take and pull the rods out of the shift forks, just come straight up and out. Then after that, I'll just kind of push the forks back out of the way. I'll leave them in their slot in between the gears, but I'll push them back out of the drum. And then I'll wiggle the drum and wiggle it out of there. So now you're just left with the 2 racks with all 3 forks in them. And then pulling the transmission out is pretty easy. Just take and grab a hold of the counter shaft and the main shaft. You can just lift both of them up and out together. It's one unit. Now go ahead and pull the collar off the crank if it's not off already. Set it aside. Next, go around the back side, push up on the oil pump gear, take it out, and then take this outer oil pump collar out as well. Alright, so now we're going to press the crank and bearing out of the left case all in one shot. To do that, I'm going to use this pretty cheap 12-ton shop press that I got from Harbor Freight. I think it was about 150 bucks. But I've got the left case chucked up in here. I've got it setting up on some 2x4s just for clearance, and the wood is a lot softer than the aluminum. Try not to damage the case. And then down underneath, I've got plenty of room for the crank to drop out. Up top, I've got the crank protector cap from my flywheel puller on the crank to protect its snout. And then since I was too lazy to move the base of my press up, I've got a bunch of stuff stacked here. It's ready to press out. So I'll have my hand underneath to catch the crank to make sure it doesn't go crashing out. Pump the jack, we'll press it out. So usually this bearing will come out and stay on the crank. It'll come out of the case. This time for mine, the bearing stayed in, so I'll show you how to get it out of there. We'll flip it back over so that we can see this seal here, and we're going to pry that seal out of there with either a seal puller or a large flat screwdriver. And I don't worry too much about damaging the seals just because I replace them every time I replace the crank bearings. The seal out, you can see the bearing in there. And over here I've got a bearing driver set. So I get the size I need to fit down in here, 46 in this instance. Go in here so that it fits loosely in the case, but it sits on that inner race of the bearing. I'll line everything back up, and while I put my hand underneath to catch the bearing, crank on the jack, press that bearing out of there. If you press your crank out of the case and the left bearing stays on the crank, usually it'll stay all the way down on. I just have this one sitting down on here to kind of show what you'll need to do. But you'll need a crank bearing puller, something like this. This one's a Tusk brand. It came from Rocky Mountain ATV. I think it was pretty inexpensive. Here are the instructions for it, and then here are all the parts and pieces that go with it. And I'll show you kind of how to set this up to be able to pull the bearing off of the crank if you need to. First, you'll take these pieces like this, get them kind of like this, loosen them up so that these will spread open and go down around the bearing. And even if this bearing is all the way down on the crank, there'll still be a gap between the crank's outer race and the crank webs there. So you put this thing on all the way down like this, then you'll tighten it up. Then you want to get them pretty tight to where the ends of this crank puller will slip kind of underneath of the bearing, in between the crank webs and the bottom of the bearing. So you tighten them up pretty snug, or as tight as you can get them. Then you'll take one of these, screw it all the way down on one side, take this piece here, slip it in, take the other one of these, slip it in, and screw it down where everything's even. Then make sure you put your crank snout protection cap on your crank snout. Take the last piece, throw it down in the center. Then you just gotta make sure everything is centered up. Slowly tighten this down with a ratchet. And as you tighten this down, it will pull up on the bearing, pull the bearing off of the crank. And then here's kind of a closer look of the bearing puller installed on the crank and bearing. And now the bearing's out, crank's out, we can move on to the bearing in the right side case. On the outside of our right inner case, we're gonna use our seal puller or big flat screwdriver and pull this crank seal here out. Now with that crank seal out, got the right case in the press now, and I'm gonna go back to my bearing driver set and get the size I need so it'll fit down in here and it'll rest on these little rollers here inside the bearing. And we're gonna press on those to press it out of the case. Now we've got that bearing pressed out of there. Okay, so now I'm gonna show you guys all the different parts of the transmission. Got the shift drum here, got the 2 shift fork pins, got the counter shaft and its rack of gears, and this is the one that the sprocket's connected to. And you've got the main shaft and its rack of gears, and this is the one that your clutch assembly is connected to. Then on the counter shaft, you've got 2 shift forks, and for these you want to look for wear here and here on each side. These actually look pretty good. I'll see if I can find one that's got some wear. Here's a fork that's got some wear on it. You can see wear marks here and then down in the saddle here. If I recall correctly, this transmission had quite a few hours on it, and it wasn't shifting great whenever we pulled it out. And then back here on the main rack, there's another shift fork. And now I'll quickly show you how to pull all the gears, bushings, thrust washers, and C-clips off of the counter shaft. Thrust washer comes off first, gear, bushing, another thrust washer, gear. Then we got a C-clip retainer on here. Use some C-clip pliers and pull those off. C-clip comes off, the washer, bushing, and the gear. And then another thick washer, another gear. And then that's all that comes off this side. We flip it around. There's a big washer here that'll come off the sprocket end. I usually use the gear to pull it off. Then the gear, bushing, another washer. So here's kind of an overall view of everything that came off of the counter shaft in order. Up here is the stuff that came off of this end first, coming on down, and then the parts that came off of the sprocket side are over here in order. Then you can pull apart the main shaft the same way. I'm not going to do that on video, but I do have a picture of the main shaft and all the parts on it taken apart, and I'll put that in the video now. That way you can at least use it for reference. If you want to inspect your transmission gears for wear, the main places to look are on the male and female engagement dogs. And the male ones are here, they look like this, they're the raised ones. And then the female ones are here. And these gears here have actually been cut a couple of times, and they've also been cut for an override. I'm gonna grab some gears that haven't been cut so you can kind of see what wear on the dogs looks like. Okay, so here are some male engagement dogs that haven't been cut and have a good bit of wear on them. You can see right here, hopefully if the camera will focus halfway decent, there's wear on that edge, and that's actually where the dogs engage. Same with over here. Then over here on the other side of this male gear, you can see this side's been cut for an override with a 45-degree cut. They definitely have some wear on them. And then on the back side where they engage, the wear is not quite as bad. And then on the female gear, you've got to look where the male engagement dogs actually engage. Hopefully you can see this gear is no good. It's had quite a bit of abuse, so this gear would definitely need replaced. Okay, then everything just goes back together the same way that it came off. At the very least, I would recommend using new snap rings or C-clips, whatever you want to call them. They usually lose some of their holding strength whenever you remove them, and it might be a good idea to go ahead and replace some of the thrush washers as well. And if gears or parts get mixed up, you can always consult your service manual. Or if you don't have a service manual, you can usually go on to like Partzilla, Rocky Mountain ATV, go to their OEM parts fiche under the transmission section, and you can see in what order these parts go back on the shafts. Now would also be a good time to go ahead and check your crank, rod, and piston for wear. To check and see what the specifications are, you can consult with the piston, rod, and crank manufacturer. If you've got stock stuff, you can check the OEM service manual. For me, I pretty much just give it a good once over. Most of our cranks are welded here on the big end. Check those for cracks. Check the gear, both sides. You can check the piston and wrist pin for wear. You can check the rod for wear. Piston skirts for wear. As you can see, the skirts on this piston are quite worn. Now I'd recommend going ahead and always checking the top of your piston for cracks or any evidence that the intake or exhaust valves have been slightly hitting or kissing the top of the piston. That could definitely mean issues down the road. And then last but not least, always try and check the big end of the rod to see if it's got any play up and down. If it's got any play up and down on the big end of the crank, it means you'll need a new crank or a rebuild. And on the inside of the right case, go ahead and inspect all the bearings and check and see if they feel notchy at all. If they feel notchy or crunchy, they'll need replaced. Make sure you have this gasket sealing surface here nice and clean. You can see where some of the old gaskets stuck to this side. I'll take a razor blade or take a rag with gas and clean that off of there. And then on the outside of the right inner case, you'll inspect these bearings as well. Check them for notchiness. Make sure you clean the gasket sealing surface over here and clean out all of the old red Loctite and all of the holes for the shifter mechanism. The left crankcase, same story. Check all the bearings. Make sure they're not worn or notchy. Make sure you clean this gasket sealing surface here really good. It needs to be free of all debris or any old gasket material. Make sure you put this stuff back in for the oil pump shaft. Make sure it spins freely. If it feels notchy at all, you're going to need replacement parts there as well. Another thing you'll need to check on your left case is how the crank bearing fits down into the crank bearing recess. If you put this thing in here and it just drops right to the bottom, and that means it's no longer a press fit. And the correct way to fix it is to get another left case. But if you actually have to put it in there and force it, press it in, the case is still good. First step is to get the left crank bearing back onto the crank. To do this, I usually freeze the crank. Normally I put it in the freezer overnight, but a couple hours should do it. And then I'll take the left bearing, put it in the oven, leave it in there for about 15 to 20 minutes at 200 to 250 degrees Fahrenheit. And then once you pull the hot bearing out of the oven, just drop it right down onto the crank. And usually they'll drop right down on and fully seat on the crank without having to press it on. Now, if you do have to end up using a press to get the bearing on, I would recommend using some of this Sunnen or Sunnen B200 lubricant. It's a press fit lubricant. It should help keep things from galling up. I got this from Goodson Supplies. Next, in order to put the entire crank assembly, the crank end bearing, into the left case, I'm going to put this entire assembly back in the freezer. And again, I usually leave it overnight, but a couple hours should do it. To install the right side crank bearing, put it in the freezer for a couple hours or overnight. After you've got your right side bearing frozen, you come out, make sure that the bearing recess is clean, free of debris, and then you'll need to heat up the case so that it expands in order for it to accept the frozen bearing. And the most efficient way that I've found to do this at home is to use one of these propane torches. You can get them at Walmart or Home Depot, local hardware store. And what I'll do is I'll light it off, and then I'll work the tip of the flame around the bearing recess to try and evenly heat the case. And I do that for somewhere between 3 to 5 minutes. You got to get it pretty hot, but you don't want to get it so hot that it starts melting the aluminum. I'd recommend starting with around 3 minutes with a propane torch, then bringing the bearing out, seeing if it'll go, and if not, take the bearing back out, put it in the freezer, let it freeze again, and then reheat the case a little longer. Try again. But my goal here is to freeze the bearing so it shrinks enough and heat the case so it expands enough to where the bearing will just drop all the way in and I won't have to press it in. The bearing should drop right in. Just make sure that it is fully seated down in the bearing recess. And in my experience, the right hand side case tends to be a little bit tighter press fit. So if you do have to use a press to get the bearing in there, use some sort of lubricant like this press fit lubricant or even engine oil. And then also make sure you use a bearing driver, something like this that is large enough so that you are pressing on the outer race of the bearing out here and not in here on the rollers. And another quick note, just because I just burnt myself on the cases, when you're heating them up with a torch, use some leather welding gloves, and that'll help keep you from getting burnt. Crank and bearing assembly in the freezer overnight. Then we'll do the same thing on the left case, heat it up with the torch, 3 to 5 minutes, pull the crank assembly out of the freezer, and it should drop in. And again, if you have to use a press for this, definitely use some sort of lubricant like this press fit lube. And this bearing should definitely be a press fit. This left side is the one that usually loses its press fit. The correct way to fix a lost press fit is to replace the case. If you're in a pinch and maybe the bearing is a little bit loose in here but not completely loose, some guys will use this green Loctite retaining compound. It's supposed to help retain a press or slip fit. I'd recommend using it pretty sparingly. Make sure you do not get it on the actual ball bearings themselves. Keep it on the case and the outer race. Alright, now the crank and bearing are all on the left side in one piece. Alright, next we're going to load the transmission into the left side case. And just taking a quick look here before we put everything in. The counter shaft, the big shaft, is going to go into this bearing here. Main shaft is going to go in this bearing here. The shift drum is going to go in this recess here. The center shift fork pin, the shorter pin, is going to go into this recess here. And then the longer shift fork pin for the left and the right shift forks is going to go into this recess here. So the easiest way that I found to do this personally is to go ahead and put the shift forks into the rack of gears that they belong on. So on the shaft on the right here, this is the main shaft. It's got a spot for one shift fork, and that is the center shift fork you see there. And then the shaft on the left here is the counter shaft. It's got 2 shift forks. This bottom groove here is for the left shift fork. It'll be marked P1L. And then the top one is for the right shift fork. It's marked P1R. Oh, and this center shift fork is marked P1C. Okay, now the easiest way that I found to install these in the cases is to take the 2 shafts, mate them together, mesh the gears together just like they're going to be in the cases, and install them as one unit with the shift forks and all. Okay, now both shafts are installed with the forks. Next step is going to be installing the shift drum. The shift drum has 3 continuous slots in it. One at the bottom, one in the center, and one at the top. The top slot is for the top shift fork, or P1R. The bottom slot is for the left shift fork, P1L. And then the center slot is for P1C, the center shift fork, here on the main shaft. And so we're going to put the shift drum in now. I usually put it in so that the dowel is at the top. And the hardest fork to get in is going to be P1C, the center shift fork back here. And as I kind of try and slip the shift drum down into its recess, kind of pull up on the main shaft a little bit so that I can get the shift fork to seat into its slot. Once the center shift fork is in its slot, take and put the left fork into its slot, which is the bottom one, and the right fork into its slot, which is the top one. Once you've got all 3 forks in their slots, take the shift fork pins, make sure you lube them up. The long one goes here, run it down through both shift forks and into its recess in the case. Yeah, make sure it's seated all the way. Short pin goes through the center shift fork down into its recess in the case. Make sure it's seated all the way. If you have an override transmission, don't forget your spring. It goes on the long shaft here. Once you've got all the transmission stuff in and your shift drum pin is clocked near the top, you should be able to take your main shaft, rotate it counterclockwise, and everything should spin freely. Next, I'll usually take some transmission oil and lube everything up. You can use assembly lube for this too. Your transmission assembly should look something like this once it's all assembled. Next, we'll put the oil pump stuff back in, lube everything up real good with oil. Shaft goes in first, then you can put the inner and outer pieces in. Make sure they spin freely. Your oil pump assembly should look like this once it's assembled. Go ahead and put your right side crank collar down on. Alright, the next step is to take a new OEM center gasket and cut it to get it ready for installation. At the very least, you're going to need to cut here and here to remove this piece. But if you have a large stroker crank or a much larger than stock cylinder, you may need to do a little bit more trimming, because for stroker cranks, they have to trench the cases here and around here. And then for large cylinders, they'll have to bore and clearance the cases up here. Easiest thing to do is, if you've got an old gasket that's somewhat intact, you can lay that old gasket over top of the new one and trace out the parts that you need to cut with a Sharpie. And then for cutting, what I like to use is a brand new and really sharp X-Acto knife, or a new and sharp razor blade. And once you've got your gasket all trimmed up, make sure that both of the inner case's mating surfaces are clean, free of dirt, debris, or old gasket. Make sure both of the dowels that go between the center cases are present. There's one here in the front of the case and one here in the top rear. Lay your gasket down on, make sure it's matched up nice and good, and then it'll be time to drop the right case on. Right case should just drop right down on. Might have to wiggle it a little bit to get it down over the transmission main shaft. The right case should drop on pretty easy. If there's something binding or it's not dropping on all the way, I'd recommend pulling it back off, double checking everything, and then trying again. Holding both cases together, flip it over to where the left side is facing up, and you're going to reinstall the 8 outer case bolts here, and then also 3 of the inner case bolts here, and I'll circle them in the video too. And next, we're going to go ahead and put in our left crankcase seal here. Okay, there's the left side seal installed. You want to make sure you get the right size. You can match it up with the old one. Make sure you lube up the seal really well as the crank and the case, so that it slides in nice and easy. And what I usually do to make sure it's seated all the way is take a really big socket, place it down over, and make sure that the seal is pressed in all the way. Now we're going to flip it over and do the same thing on the right side with the right hand side crank seal. Same thing with the right side crank seal. Make sure you lube up the seal, the crank, and the case. Push it in gently. You can use a bearing driver or a large socket to get it in all the way. Make sure it's at least flush with the outside of the case here, but don't press it in too far. So if you press it in as far as it'll go almost all the way through, and the back side of it will hit the bearing in there, and you won't have a seal here. So you'll have engine and transmission oil mixing. So it's important to get this thing in correctly. The First thing that I like to do after I put a set of cases together is install all of the shift drum and ratcheting mechanism here, put the shift shaft in, and then put a shifter on it and make sure it will change through all the gears, 1 through 5 and neutral. So the first thing to go on will be the spring, goes on like that. And then after the spring, it's going to be this combination of the small washer next, the ratcheting arm, and this shouldered bolt. Okay, here's the spring and arm assembly all installed. From the bottom to the top, they go in this order: spring, then the washer, then the arm, and then the shouldered bolt. Make sure your arm is sitting over top of the spring down here. There is no torque spec for this bolt. Make sure you snug it up pretty good, and then afterwards make sure your arm is still free moving. This thing needs to be not binding or too tight. The manual does call for some red Loctite on this bolt. I do use red Loctite on it. Also make sure to clean any old Loctite off of the bolt and the case hole where it goes. So next we'll install this guy, and to do that we're going to line up this little indentation here with the pin on the shift drum there. That pin is going to sit inside of this, and then we're going to put a dab of red Loctite on this bolt, and it's going to run down in like that. And this bolt does get torqued to 16 foot-pounds. And so it's a little tricky to get this guy in here, especially with the arm already installed. What I'm going to do is have a helper take a large flat screwdriver. I'm going to pull this guy back all the way so that I can seat this and tighten it down. Now if you do it this way and you use a flat screwdriver or something to hold this arm back, make sure you don't damage this piece here. There's those two mechanisms installed. Next we'll put this plate on. The inner piece has a hole that bolt goes through, and then you can see how the inner piece just slides right down inside. The plate is kind of sandwiched in between, and definitely don't forget this little bushing here. Next we'll install the two bolts to hold the plate on. They get a little bit of Loctite. There is no torque spec for those. Snug them up pretty good. With that plate bolted down, the next step will be to install our shift shaft. Make sure you've got this little washer on here. Slide it right down in the hole. Make sure the stud on the case goes between the spring and this large open slot in the shift shaft's arm. And on the other side, make sure this slot in the arm is over top of the bushing on the ratcheting assembly. Now we can throw a shifter on the other side and try to run it through the gears, make sure it shifts good, and we can hit all 5 gears. And during the shifting process, you might have to move the main shaft and the counter shaft back and forth a little bit to get them to click in. That is normal. If everything shifts fine, we can move forward. If there's a shifting issue, you can check this mechanism first. And if the issue isn't here, you may need to split the cases again to make sure everything is installed properly with the shift drum, shift forks, and both transmission shafts and all their gears. Okay, for the rest of the assembly, there's a few different orders you can take in putting everything back together. What I like to do next is at least go ahead and put the cylinder back on. That way, whenever I'm putting the basket and the gears on over here, or the stator on and torquing everything down, I don't have to worry about the piston flopping around unsupported. So that's what we're going to do next. Make sure your gasket sealing surface down here on the bottom of the cases is clean, free of any old gasket material, dirt, dust, debris. Make sure you've got the cylinder dowels in their proper spot. And if you're running an engine with coolant, there's a little thing that goes here for the coolant passage, and I think an O-ring. Make sure that's there. You put your base gasket on, it can only go one way. Then next you can drop your cylinder down over the studs. And if you've got an old worn piston like I do, the rings have been on here for a little while, you should just be able to squeeze the rings together, kind of walk the cylinder down or walk the piston up into the cylinder fairly easily. Just make sure you go slow, take your time. You want to make sure that you don't fold over one of these small oil rings down here below the compression ring. And if you have a whole lot of trouble getting the piston up in the cylinder, like let's say you've got a new piston, a new set of rings, the easiest way that I've found to do it is to go ahead and take one of these circlips out here, pull the pin out, take the piston off, flip the cylinder upside down, flip the piston upside down, and work the piston down into the bottom of the cylinder. That way gravity is kind of trying to assist you rather than here it's kind of working against you. Okay, so the next step after you get the cylinder on is to clean the bottom of the cylinder head and the top of the cylinder. Actually, you might want to do that before you put the cylinder on. Then you'll need to put the cam chain guide down in. It's got a little piece that sits in the cylinder about right here. and then it sets in the case right down here. Then you'll put your gasket on, then you'll put your head on. After that, you'll put the nuts on the head studs, torque them down. Stock is 40 foot-pounds, and then if you've got ARP studs, torque is 50 foot-pounds. After you've got all 4 of those torqued down, I usually do an X pattern and do them 10 foot-pounds at a time. So we're 10, then 20, then 30, then 40, then 50, doing all 4 like that, just to try and keep the load even over the head gasket. Then you can put the 2 head to cylinder bolts in here on the side, and the 1 cylinder to case bolt here on the side. Those don't have a torque specification, so just snug them up to whatever feels best. And again, I'm showing all this going back on as one unit, the cylinder and the head, because I used this glue and a copper gasket, and I didn't have the help to be able to separate these two, because this glue really sticks. A few of our next steps are going to be here on the left side of the engine. We're going to take this little relief valve, put it back in its case recess here, and install the bolt with the keeper there, tighten it down and snug it up. Next, we'll put the oil pickup in. Before you put it in, make sure it's clean down here in the screen where it picks oil up, and make sure both of these rubber gaskets are on here as well. And then with that in its place, we'll put in the bolt and the retaining clip and tighten it down. Next, we'll put the oil pump driven gear on, and then I recommend going ahead and getting a new C-clip for it, and we'll use some snap ring pliers to put it on. And there's the snap ring installed. And while we're over here on the left side, I like to go ahead and put the countershaft bushing and O-ring on, just so I don't forget it. Next, we'll go ahead and take our counterbalancer assembly and feed it through to the right side. And just make sure you've got it pushed all the way through, and it's meshed up with the oil pump gear. Then coming over here on the right side, put the long key down into the counterbalancer shaft. Next, we'll slide this gear over the key. Next, we're going to put our first gear on the crank, and there's 2 important parts to this. So the crankshaft will have a dot here, and I'd recommend rotating your crankshaft around to where the dot is on the top. And then over here on the counterbalancer gear, you'll have 2 dots on this gear. Then here with this gear that goes on the crank, there's kind of a space. You'll have teeth all the way around the inside, and then there'll be a space here at the top. That space will straddle the dot on the crank, and then this dot here on the gear should land between these 2 dots here on the counterbalancer gear. And so hopefully that's showing up okay on camera. Again, the spaced teeth here on this large crank gear, it's going to straddle the dot on the crank, and then these 2 here should line up as well. And all of this is to make sure that the counterbalancer weight is timed correctly to the rest of the engine. Okay, next we'll put our weight on here, and it just lines up and goes in the slot for the key. Put our washer on, and then we'll put our new counterbalancer nut on. And this nut is something that I replace every time just because it gets staked. If you're in a pinch and don't have a new one, you can reuse the old one. So for now, we're just going to snug that guy up, and then we'll take our next large outer crank gear. And again, this gear has a slot in it where it's missing teeth up here at the top. You're going to straddle the crank dot with that. This gear also has a dot here, and they should all line up across there between the crank gears and the counterbalancer gears and weight. Okay, next, if you've got a kicker bike or an electric start bike, I think there's going to be some different gears that you're going to have to put on in here. Again, this bike doesn't have those. So just consult your service manual and follow the instructions there. For us, our next step is going to be putting this collar onto the main shaft, and then this little carriage of needle bearings goes over top of it. Next, we'll take our clutch basket, and it gets seated down over top, and the gear on the back of the basket is meshed with this outer crank gear here. The large washer that goes between the basket and the hub goes on next. And then our clutch inner hub will go on next. This large washer will go on next. Then a new OEM lock washer will go on, followed by the nut. Now we'll use a clutch hub holding tool to hold the basket in place while we torque this nut down to 80 foot-pounds. With the nut torqued down, now we need to fold up these 2 flaps on the lock washer to keep this nut from backing out. Next, we'll put our gear jammer here on this crank gear and jam it to the gear on the back of the basket. We'll torque this down to 47 foot-pounds with our special socket. And then we'll put the gear jammer like this between the rear crank gear and the counterbalancer gear. And we'll put the washer and the crank bolt back in. And I think you can either use blue or red Loctite on this guy and tighten him down pretty good. I don't think there's a torque spec on that, but consult your service manual. And then make sure you use a hammer and small screwdriver to stake this nut to the counterbalancer shaft. Next, we'll put our clutch pack back in, and it goes back in the same way that it came out. If you've got a judder spring, consult your manual for what fiber goes where, but you should start with a fiber, alternate to a steel, back to a fiber till the end, and you should be ending with a fiber. If you've got a new clutch pack, make sure you you've soaked at least the fibers overnight in the transmission oil that you're going to use. You don't want to put the fibers in dry. After that, you can go ahead and put your clutch arm in on the left side of the bike. Then the actuator rod will go down into the transmission main shaft along with this little guy with the needle bearings. And on the left side, work the clutch arm back and forth to make sure that the rod gets seated properly. Next, we'll put this little washer on, and the pressure plate goes on next. Put your 6 clutch springs in next, followed by the clutch spring bolts, or in this case a lockout, and torque the bolts in a crisscross pattern to 9 foot-pounds. Next, you can go ahead and put your right side outer cover back on. Make sure your gasket mating surfaces are nice and clean. Make sure you've got the 2 dowels that go in between them. Make sure you've got this sleeve and O-ring here for your coolant passage. And then lastly, you got to make sure this end of the counterbalancer shaft is aligned with the water pump that is in the right side outer case. Put it back in, snug up all the bolts, and then I think we're pretty much done with the right side. Next, we'll take our cam chain tensioner piece, drop it down in from the top. This little bushing goes in from the back, and then we'll put a dab of red Loctite on the bolt and snug it down. After you snug that bolt down, make sure your cam chain tensioner will move freely back and forth without any restriction or binding. Our cam chain will go in next. It should move freely with no kinks. If it's got kinks or if it's worn, now is a good time to go ahead and replace it. Anyways, we'll drop it in from the top, pull it around the crank snout, get it to come over the crank gear, and then to kind of keep that thing in place, I'll usually take a magnet like this, stick to the cam chain, and hang it off the back side of the cylinder head. Next, we'll take the retaining plate, put it on, put a dab of Loctite on the bolt, and snug it down. The flywheel's woodruff key will go on next. It just sits down in this slot in the crank. Flywheel slides on next, aligning the woodruff key with the slot in the flywheel. Make sure your flywheel is seated all the way. Put your washer on, followed by the nut, and we'll torque this to 54 foot-pounds. Next, we'll put the stator cover back on, but before we do that, make sure that your gasket sealing surface here is nice and clean, free of debris. A lot of times you can reuse the old stator gasket, but if it's torn or there's big chunks and pieces on one side or the other, might be time to go ahead and replace it. Before you put it on, make sure the dowels are present, one that goes here and one that goes here, and they should either be in this left outer case or in the stator cover itself. And then another thing that you can do is go ahead and get your flywheel set to where the T mark is kind of sort of close to the cylinder bolt here. And the T mark I'm talking about is right there on the flywheel. I put a little dab of white paint on there so that I could find it easier, but we're going to need to be able to find this T on the flywheel when we're attempting to time the engine appropriately. So just know that there is an F and a T, and the mark that we're going to want to find on the flywheel, once we put our stator cover back on, we take our check hole cap off, we're going to want to find the T mark. So now we'll put our stator cover and gasket on. Make sure you go slow. Again, the stator is kind of a big magnet. Flywheel is a big piece of steel. They're going to want to stick together. So once you get that stator cover kind of close to this flywheel, it's going to want to on. With the stator cover back on, you'll put in the 9 bolts around and tighten them down. And then we'll go ahead and remove the crank hole check cap here so that we can see the flywheel and that timing mark that I talked about earlier. Now coming back up to the top of the engine, put your 4 shims back in, the 2 on the exhaust side and the 2 on the intake side. Hopefully you did write down which shim went where. Now with our 4 shims back in, we can drop the cam carrier assembly down on and tighten it down with the 4 bolts. And those get torqued to 10 foot-pounds. Okay, now we've got the cam carrier assembly back on, installed, torqued down to 10 foot-pounds with these 4 bolts. We've got our cam pointing back and slightly up, and right now would be a very good time to go ahead and check your valve clearances if you haven't already. Normally the intake valve should be set at 6 thousandths of an inch and the exhaust valve should be set at around 11 thousandths of an inch. That's the stock specs for the stock camshaft. If you've got an aftermarket camshaft, consult the cam card, the cam manufacturer, or your builder. And to check your valve clearances, you can use feeler gauges, something like this, or these are pretty nice as well. And to adjust your valve clearances, I recommend picking up a Hott Cam shim kit. You can get them on Woodward Specialties, Rocky Mountain ATV, or Amazon. And for more detail on how to check and adjust your valves, you can check out the Valve Adjustment How-To webpage or the Hot Boys Garage episode where I talk about degreeing a camshaft. I'm not going to go into the details here on this video, but I'll stick links to both of those in the video description. Now, as long as your cam is pointing back and slightly up, and your crank check hole cap is off, you're going to go around to the right side of the engine and remove the crank check hole cap and rotate the engine slowly over using the crank bolt and an Allen cap on a ratchet. And what you're looking to do is line up that T dash mark on the flywheel with this slit in the stator cover here. And if you followed the advice earlier of getting the flywheel close to where the cylinder bolt is, you shouldn't have to rotate it very far. So get that lined up and then take your cam sprocket, put it up here, feed it through and put it in your cam chain and slip it up onto the cam sprocket. Okay, so what we're looking for is to have your cam lobes facing back and slightly up, the T on the flywheel lined up with the slit in the flywheel check hole cap, and this mark right here on the cam gear lined up with the arrow behind it on the cam tower. And I don't know if you can see that on the video, the little arrow on this billet cam tower. It kind of stinks, but the arrow on a cast stock cam tower is going to be a lot more apparent. So come down to where you're level with the marks and they should all line up. If they do not, you'll need to take the cam sprocket back off the cam flange, take it kind of down and out of the cam chain and rotate it around inside of the cam chain, put it back up on the cam flange, check it again, and keep moving it until those marks line up perfectly. And that's how you know that the engine is correctly timed. After all that, take the 2 cam sprocket bolts, put some red Loctite on, put them in, tighten them down. I think there is a torque spec on those, but I usually just get them good and tight. Also, don't forget to put your cam chain tensioner back on. Again, this one has a manual cam chain tensioner. Yours will look a little different. Put it on, tighten it down, and double check your timing marks to make sure everything still lines up with tension on the cam chain. Also, don't forget to put your flywheel check hole cap back in and tighten it down. Okay, now with the tensioner back on, flywheel check hole cap back in, and our cam sprocket bolts Loctited and tightened down, we can put the valve cover back on. Make sure it's got a good gasket that's free of rips or tears. You put the 3 valve cover bolts back in, and they get torqued down to 7 foot-pounds. Except for getting your engine back in the frame and getting everything hooked back up, that should be about it. Hope you guys enjoyed the episode. Hopefully it was helpful in one way or the other. And I'd like to give a quick thanks to John Dyer from Racer's Edge, Arizona, and my buddy Cole Pominville. They've helped me along the way with a lot of questions I had when learning how to split the cases and disassemble and reassemble a transmission. So until next time, I think that's a wrap. In between videos, you can follow me on social media at Hot Boys Racing on Instagram, and you can search for Hot Boys Racing on Facebook with 2 T's to follow our ATV drag racing page. I'll stick links to both of those in the video description. Thanks for watching.